Okay, let's talk training phases and the progression of these training phases throughout a year or season. We start with our post-season, which leads into preparatory or prep phase, which leads to the build phase, and then we go through our fitness phase into race phase or race specific phase. So post-season, as the name suggests, begins immediately following the last race or the last key race of an athlete's season. The goal of this phase is recovery and regeneration. And when we talk about recovery and regeneration, we're talking about physical demands of training and racing, but also allowing mental and emotional recovery from these demands. So it begins immediately following the last race towards the end of the season. It's going to last 2 to 4 weeks, and generally there's little to no structure in terms of trainings because the purpose of it is to recover and regenerate. What we do during this phase is also have a little bit of a reflection on how training went in the previous season, and then we reset and reload. The resetting and reload leads us into the prep phase. The prep phase is typically 8 to 12 weeks in duration. It can be longer. And in some ways, this is the most important phase of all the phases, even though you're at almost at the furthest point from race season. And the reason for that is the prep phase is a great opportunity to build on what you reflected on through the post-season and actually put that into practice. So we do a lot of technical development, but also a lot of end of range work in terms of cadence and effort. So very, very high intensity work, but over short bouts. And also looking at ranging the cadence, especially on the bike. Although it's very important, the prep phase is often the lowest demand on people's time, energy and effort, but it really does set up for the build phase and the race phase and really sets up the season. If you're looking to build a really well-rounded, robust athlete, not just an endurance athlete or a triathlete, then you'd be looking at replicating what you do in the prep phase. So a lot of people talk about maintenance mode through winter, that type of thing. For us at Jet Coaching, we're going through the prep phase. Our maintenance is about resetting really good habits, including strength work, eating habits, sleeping habits, looking at the overall training routine and structure, working on end of range, and working on a mix of really low intensity work, but mixing in some really highly demanding, highly challenging training sessions in on that. And what that means is you arrive at the end of the preparatory phase starting to form really good habits and in a really good place to build upon that. Naturally, from the prep phase, we then build as we get a little bit closer towards race season. And the build phase is again somewhere between 6 and 10 weeks in duration, and we're basically building upon the work that we've done during the prep phase, the foundation that we've laid during the prep phase, and we're also building towards race season itself. So we're still doing strength endurance, we're still doing end of range work, we're still working on our global strength work and trying to maintain and sustain the habits that we've set up during the prep phase, but we're just essentially increasing the time spent at the high intensity, so starting to prolong some of those intervals, and prolonging the time spent at end of range. So again, by the time you're at the end of the prep and build phase, which obviously are a natural progression from one another, you're really, really healthy, you're really, really fit, and you're really, really robust as an athlete, and you're a well-rounded athlete rather than just a triathlete who can go and do a 70.3 or an Ironman. So often towards the end of the build phase, you might do some very early season races, or you might do some running races, and you don't really going to do any specific work for those races. But what they really do is every year they really highlight how fit you can get through the prep phase and build phase, which, as I mentioned before, don't really have a really high demand on overall training time, but they mix in some really good general endurance work with healthy doses of very high intensity work. From the build phase, there's almost an optional phase that we call the fitness phase, so that's fitness with a PH. This is a really short phase, between 2 and 4 weeks, that's designed to really cause a steep increase in overall fitness and conditioning. So this is a bridge between the build phase and the race phase. It's not used for all athletes because it is highly demanding, but it bridges between and continues the progression of the build phase before getting into race phase. Finally, we look at race phase, which in some ways has 2 components to it. So essentially the race phase, as the name suggests, is about preparing the athlete for the demands of the race. So all the key sessions in the race phase are centered around being physically, mentally and emotionally prepared for race day. This includes physiological gains and matching those to the demands of the race, but also includes looking at the technical aspects such as pacing, nutrition, hydration, postural fitness, bike fitness and equipment choices. So this phase varies in length between 8 and 10 weeks before the first race of the season, right through to the final race of the season. So the whole thing may be 16 to 24 weeks or 4 to 6 months, and generally that is the summer months, obviously, where the majority of the key races, the big races, the long course races, but also where the short course season runs as well. Following the end of the race phase and the end of that final race of the season, which is often very different, or not very different, can be slightly different, but for different athletes, we rinse and repeat. And the beauty of this is it removes the risk, or reduces the risk of emotional staleness, which comes from repeatedly doing race builds. And it's something that can be built upon season on season, year on year. So it's designed to allow for continued progression and development as an athlete, which optimizes performance rather than just simply going race to race to race. Hope that helps. Hope that gives a bit of an overview and an insight as to how we do it, but also why we do it. If you've got any questions, let us know. Cheers.